First thing on the docket, as usual, Spurge, is the not the news topic, which you alluded to in the intro there, which has to do with Missouri helmet law. Before we start the timer here, why don't you talk everyone through when exactly this happened? There was a law in place and then it was repealed. Is that correct?
Yep. So Missouri basically repealed their version of a helmet law for folks over the age of 26 that had valid motorcycle insurance or something along those lines. So what our colleague Dustin Whelan did was wrote an article over on Common Tread comparing 2020 numbers of where helmet fatality or motorcycle fatalities were to 2023 numbers. And there was an increase, pretty significant increase in motorcycle fatalities now that the helmet law has been repealed.
Right. So,
or adjusted.
Let's start the timer and let's dissect what we can learn from this data. There are a few interesting things here that we should say from the get-go that the data is a little bit incomplete from the standpoint of what every motorcyclist would like to know. Like there's no information on like when there was a car involved or when it was a sort of operator error. I don't think there's data in this study about alcohol being related or not related, which we know has have a huge effect on people's ability to control a vehicle. So there are some question marks around this study, but the big takeaways is that there was a 47% increase in motorcycle fatalities, and most of those were people not wearing a helmet.
Yes, of the 174 fatalities recorded in 23, 97 people were not wearing a motorcycle helmet. 77 riders were. So over half. Now, obviously, I think there's a couple ways you can interpret that. You know, if you have the freedom-loving crowd is going to say, well, look at that. 77 people were wearing a helmet and they still, did not make it through. But I think really if we looked at the total fatalities in 2020, there were 118 fatalities. Now, we don't know if they were all wearing helmets. We're going to assume that the majority of them were wearing helmets because there was a helmet law in place. But, you know, to go from 118 fatalities to 174 is still a 47% increase in motorcycle fatalities. Yes. And the other thing that was talked about here was a lot of, I think it was over half of the helmetless fatalities are attributed to people that were either not licensed or improperly licensed to operate a motorcycle.
Right, which makes you wonder about the accessibility that not having a helmet provides to someone who has a motor. Obviously, this is like, we're really reaching into the dark corners of this data here. We don't know what the statistics are, but it does kind of stand to reason that if you didn't have to wear a helmet, it would be easier to hop on a bike and just give it a try when you don't have a license, which is obviously not a good thing to do. As we come to the end of this quick not the news topic, Spurge, what do you think the kind of takeaway is here? Like, helmets are good, or helmets have the ability to help protect your head if you crash a motorcycle, which is sort of like a pretty obvious thing to say, but I don't know. What else do you take away from this?
I think it's one of those ones where, you know, Zach and I were talking in the pre-production of this, and like we're both guilty, right? Like we both hopped on a motorcycle in our youth and rode down to the local gas station to see what it was like, just to be a bit of a rebel. But I think we've also acknowledged that, you know, motorcycle helmets can lead to comfort. They can lead to a more enjoyable experience on a motorcycle. They can, you know, lead to obviously a better chance of surviving a motorcycle crash. But there's also then the flip side of that with, you know, the additional cost. Buzzer's going off, so we'll wrap this up. I think what we need to do a better job, and hopefully this episode of the podcast can kind of, you know, allude to it, is that there is a bit of a revolution happening right now with motorcycle technology and motorcycle safety technology as it relates to apparel, in that it's becoming more affordable. It's becoming more accessible. We have fewer and fewer reasons to say like, oh, I wasn't wearing a motorcycle helmet, you know, or a jacket, because it is becoming a much more democratized in its availability. So I can understand the freedom-loving crowd saying, well, I don't wear a helmet because I like the way it feels. What I would say is that I don't necessarily think that holds up where people have been like, oh, well, it impedes my vision and I can't see as well, and all the other excuses that we sometimes hear.
Right. Well, it is an interesting dissection of data and snapshot of of how legislation can affect the motorcycling public and pastime, you can find that article over at commentread@RevZilla.com. It is called "Missouri Sets Motorcycle Fatality Record After State Repeals Helmet Law." Thanks for coming along.
It would be interesting to see if they have. It would be interesting to see if they have any, like, as this starts to digest, if there's any backlash to this. Right? They're never. We see these studies come out, but we never seem to see, public outcry or backlash necessarily.
I suppose that could happen, but maybe it's like too specific a thing for people to get upset about because it doesn't seem polarizing enough. One thing I did find, last thing I'll say I found interesting about in this article is it pointed out that the Missouri governor considered removing mandatory helmet laws for 18-year-olds that have health insurance, but ultimately vetoed that bill. So there's stuff in the dark there, like maybe that bill included other things that the governor wanted to veto, and I don't really know the governor's policies very specifically.
But you kind of get a good sense of who he is just by the photo of him in the article.
That's unfortunately true.
Looks like the Cheshire cat trying to steal your lunch money.
So I think it's interesting that there was a line drawn somewhere where it's sort of like 18-year-olds not wearing a helmet. That's ridiculous. 26-year-olds, no problem. I'm not sure what other sort of healthcare industry policies might have affected that or whatever, but it's always interesting. It's just like a little window into the brain of a legislator, kind of like thinking one thing's okay and something else is not.